You recall from Module 1 that residential real estate is ground zero for the crisis. And we talked about interest rates and we talked about the Federal Reserve when we discussed new home sales. But take a look at this chart, chart 6.1, which you can easily find on your screen, and you'll see exactly what I mean about the interest rate dynamic. Take a look at how interest rates fluctuated severely in our post-World War II history. You've got every year here, 1950 right up to the present. You can see our scale from 0 up to 20. This depicts the federal funds rate, and the federal funds rate is just the rate at which the Federal Reserve, our central bank, lends to member banks. So, if business is booming, the Fed is compelled to lend a lot because the banks are borrowing a lot of reserves. If business is slack and slow, the banks aren't borrowing a lot of reserves because they don't have to do a lot of lending, those interest rates will fall. So the rising interest rates are a sign of boom conditions. Well, every time there was a housing boom, the Federal Reserve eventually became afraid of inflation and tried to cut back on residential construction by forcing those rates up. And as the banks try to borrow more reserves in order to do more lending, like mortgage lending, sure enough, the Federal Reserve made it tougher on them and the rates rose. So you can see during the big housing boom of the late 60s, during the big housing boom of the early 70s, big housing boom of the late 70s, those interest rates would rise as the Fed tightened up. And then, of course, you can see the period of slack, interest rates fall, the Federal Reserve is easing up. And typically that would occur during any recession. So during a recession, housing would come back down, fewer home sales, the Federal Reserve would ease up, make it easier for the banks to lend, and those interest rates, the rate at which the Fed lends to the banks, called the federal funds rate, would plunge. Well, you recall what we said. When we get to the dot-com bust of 2000-2001, the Federal Reserve once again wanted to stimulate the economy. But that time, the dot-com bust, there was a technology slump, not a housing slump. So when the Federal Reserve sent those interest rates down into the basement, and you can see how low they are right here on your chart by following the cursor. When the Federal Reserve sent those interest rates into the basement, the housing market exploded. And we not only had record new home sales, we also had a fantastic, unprecedented rise in residential real estate prices. That's what we call the asset inflation. The value of those assets rose. And you can see the consequences and you can see the effect of this when we turn to the next chart, chart 6.3. Sure enough, when we look at private borrowing, you can see the effect of that terrific boom, the dot-com boom of 1995 to 2000, and then this huge run-up, 2001, 2002, 2003, right up through 2006. You can see the private borrowing rising. This is all private, non-financial borrowing. That means this is, by non-financial, we mean borrowing done by borrowers other than financial institutions. So this was business borrowing, and of course it's also mortgage borrowing by households. And of course the big one here was the mortgage borrowing by households. And you can see how it climbed and climbed. And so when the Federal Reserve sent interest rates into the basement, the private borrowing surged as people bought more homes, new homes, bought existing homes and sent the prices up into the stratosphere. And that's the background for the great expansion we had that began to unravel in the year 2006.